The night my sister said I was embarrassing the family, the ballroom smelled faintly of gardenias and expensive perfume. Crystal chandeliers hung above us like frozen waterfalls, scattering warm light across hundreds of polished glasses and gold-rimmed plates. A string quartet played softly near the stage, the slow notes of a violin weaving through the low hum of wealthy conversation. Every seat in the room was filled. 200 of the city's most powerful people had gathered for one reason: my sister's charity gala. And standing near the entrance in a simple navy dress that suddenly felt painfully ordinary, I realized something very clearly. I did not belong here, at least not according to my sister. Victoria Hartwell glided through the crowd like the event belonged to her, which, in a way, it did. Cameras flashed as she greeted donors and sponsors, her practiced smile flawless, her posture regal. Every movement was calculated, every laugh perfectly timed. People adored her. They always had. Victoria was the kind of woman who could walk into a room and immediately command it. And me? I was the woman who noticed the things everyone else ignored. My name is Adeline Hartwell. I'm 43 years old, and this story happened in Chicago. If you had asked anyone in that ballroom who the successful Hartwell sister was, they would have pointed to Victoria without hesitation. She was the philanthropist, the socialite, the public face of generosity. But what no one in that room understood, what they would only discover later that night, was that Victoria's perfect reputation had been built on a lifetime of carefully buried betrayals. And most of those betrayals were against me. People think revenge stories begin with a single moment, a single insult, a single betrayal. But the truth is, real revenge is usually built slowly, piece by piece, year after year. Victoria had been taking from me for most of my life. And the strange part, for a long time, I let her. We were children when I first learned what my sister was capable of. Victoria was 3 years older than me, and even then she had a talent for turning people to her side. Teachers adored her. Neighbors praised her manners. Adults called her such a remarkable young lady. At home, though, things were different. I was the quiet one who preferred books to people. Numbers fascinated me in a way stories never could. I spent hours solving puzzles or organizing small imaginary ledgers in my notebooks. Victoria spent her time studying people instead. When I was 16, I won a statewide academic scholarship. It covered my entire first year at a prestigious summer program for finance and economics students. Only 20 students in the state were selected. I remember the day the acceptance letter arrived. I ran into the kitchen waving it, breathless with excitement. Mom, Dad, I got it. Victoria was sitting at the table flipping through a fashion magazine. She barely looked up, but I saw the flicker in her eyes. Envy. That evening she congratulated me warmly in front of our parents. But 2 weeks later, something strange happened. The scholarship committee called our house asking why I had declined the offer. Declined it? I had never declined anything. When I contacted the program, they told me they had received a signed withdrawal letter in my name. By the time we figured out what happened, the position had already been given to someone else. I was devastated. Victoria hugged me that night and whispered, "I'm sure something even better will come along." It took me years to learn the truth. She had forged my signature. She wanted the program for herself, and somehow, she got it. My parents never believed she would do something like that. Victoria cried, denied everything, and convinced them the scholarship office must have made a mistake. That was the first time she took something from me. It would not be the last. As we grew older, the pattern repeated itself. Victoria never attacked directly. She preferred quieter methods. When I was 25, I spent 2 years developing a business proposal for a nonprofit micro-grant program to help small community organizations. It was something I cared deeply about. Victoria asked to read my proposal. A month later, she announced she had been invited to speak at a charity conference. Her presentation? A new initiative to fund community microgrants. The program she described was nearly identical to my proposal. My name was never mentioned. When I confronted her privately, she smiled calmly and said something I would never forget. "You should be grateful, Adeline. Ideas only matter if someone charismatic enough presents them." That sentence stayed with me for years. Our parents eventually stopped trying to referee the quiet war between us. To them, Victoria was simply more successful. She was visible, public, admired. I worked quietly in financial compliance, auditing nonprofit organizations and ensuring donations were used properly. My job rarely made headlines, but it made me very good at spotting when numbers didn't add up. And over time, something about Victoria's success began to bother me. Her charity events raised enormous sums of money, millions, but when I looked at public filings, the financial transparency was unusual, not illegal, just unusually vague. Still, I never accused her of anything. She was my sister. Despite everything, I still wanted to believe she wasn't capable of crossing certain lines. 6 weeks before the gala, I received a message that surprised me. It came from Victoria. "You should come to the Hartwell Foundation Gala this year." I stared at the message for a long time. In 8 years of hosting the gala, she had never invited me before. Tickets alone cost $5,000. Tables went for $50,000. It was the most prestigious charity event in the city, and suddenly, she wanted me there. I should have been suspicious, but part of me hoped something had changed. Maybe she wanted to repair our relationship. Maybe time had softened the rivalry between us. I replied simply, "I'd like that." Her response came seconds later. "Great, just keep things low-key." I didn't realize at the time that the invitation had nothing to do with reconciliation. Victoria had a very specific reason for wanting me in that ballroom, and it had everything to do with a document that would be placed in every guest's hands that night, the donor list. The evening unfolded exactly as Victoria planned. Wealthy donors arrived one after another. Photographers crowded the entrance. Politicians shook hands with corporate executives. The event was flawless, until Victoria noticed me speaking with one of the foundation's financial sponsors. Her smile froze. Moments later, she walked toward me. From a distance, she looked as warm and elegant as ever. But when she reached my side, her voice dropped to a whisper. "Adeline, what are you doing?" "Talking to the sponsor you introduced me to." Her eyes narrowed. "You're not dressed for networking." I looked down at my navy dress. "It's a dress, Victoria." Her smile returned instantly as 2 guests passed by. Then she leaned closer and murmured the words that would change the entire night. "Please stop wandering around like you belong here." I stared at her. "Excuse me?" She kept smiling for the watching crowd, but her voice turned sharp. "You're embarrassing the family." For a moment, the noise of the ballroom seemed to fade. All I could hear was the soft music and my own heartbeat. And suddenly, something inside me changed, because I realized something important. Victoria hadn't invited me to reconnect. She invited me because she believed I would stay quiet. She believed I would smile politely and leave before noticing anything unusual. But there was one small problem with that plan. At the table where I was seated sat a printed program booklet, and inside that booklet was a donor list. A list filled with names I recognized for reasons Victoria could never imagine. Names connected to investigations, financial scandals, and shell organizations that didn't belong anywhere near a legitimate charity event. I opened the booklet slowly, and as I began reading the list of donors, I felt a cold realization settle in my chest. Because Victoria hadn't just embarrassed me that night, she had accidentally invited the one person in the city who could expose everything she had built. And before the evening ended, everyone in that ballroom was going to learn the truth. The first thing I learned in financial compliance is that numbers rarely lie. People do. They dress them up. They rearrange them. They bury them under layers of paperwork and polished language. But if you sit with the numbers long enough, they start to speak. And as I sat at that table, flipping through the glossy program booklet from my sister's gala, I could already hear them whispering. Something was wrong. At first glance, the donor list looked exactly the way it was supposed to. Corporate sponsors, private foundations, a handful of wealthy individuals with recognizable names. The categories were neatly arranged. Platinum sponsors, gold benefactor, civil contributor, Severy. About it screamed legitimacy. But then I slowed down, and that's when the inconsistencies began to surface. The first name that caught my attention was Arden Crest Holdings. To anyone else in that room, it would have looked like just another real estate investment firm. But I had seen that name before. 6 months earlier, it had appeared in a compliance report tied to a federal inquiry into inflated property valuations and suspicious fund transfers between shell subsidiaries. The case hadn't gone public yet, but internally, it had been flagged as high risk. I flipped the page. The next name, Velmer Consulting Group. That one made my pulse quicken. Velmer wasn't just under investigation. It had been quietly blacklisted by 2 financial institutions after inconsistencies were found in their charitable disbursement claims. And yet here they were, listed as a platinum sponsor, pledging nearly $1 million. I felt a slow, creeping unease settle into my chest, because 1 irregular donor could be a coincidence, 2 could still be explained, but 3 meant a pattern. I reached for my phone under the table, shielding the screen with my hand. Carefully, I began cross-referencing names from memory. Years of working in nonprofit auditing had trained my brain to retain details most people would overlook. And one by one, the connections started forming. A logistics firm that had been investigated for tax evasion. A foundation that didn't exist in any public registry. A private donor whose name appeared in connection with offshore accounts. Each one had something in common. They weren't clean, and yet together, they accounted for nearly 40% of the total pledged donations listed in the booklet. That wasn't just unusual. That was dangerous. I lowered the booklet slowly, my mind racing. Victoria knew what I did for a living. She had always known. So why would she invite me into a room filled with financial inconsistencies that were this obvious? Unless, the thought hit me all at once, she didn't expect me to look closely. Or worse, she believed that even if I noticed something, I wouldn't act on it. Because I was her sister. Because I had always stayed quiet before. Because I had spent years letting her take what she wanted without consequence. A small, bitter realization formed at the edge of my thoughts. Victoria hadn't changed. She had just gotten more confident. Enjoying the evening, the voice pulled me out of my thoughts. I looked up to see a man in his early 50s taking the empty seat beside me. Tailored tuxedo, confident posture, the kind of presence that suggested he was used to being listened to. I said politely. I'm Richard Hale, he said, extending his hand. One of the foundation's longtime supporters. I shook it. Adeline Hartwell. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Victoria's sister. There it was. The recognition. Followed quickly by something else. Surprise. I didn't realize she had family attending tonight, he added. I don't usually, I replied. He smiled faintly. Well, this is quite the year to start. I tilted my head slightly. What makes this year different? He leaned back in his chair, glancing briefly toward the stage where Victoria was speaking with a group of donors. Let's just say, the scale of funding has grown significantly. I studied his expression carefully. There was something in his tone, something measured. You sound uncertain, I said. He chuckled softly. Let's just say I've been in this world long enough to know when numbers grow faster than they should. That confirmed it. I wasn't the only one who had noticed. Have all the pledged donations been processed? I asked carefully. Richard's eyes flickered toward me, sharper now. Why do you ask? I held up the program booklet slightly. Some of these figures seem ambitious. He studied me for a moment longer than necessary. Then he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Between you and me? I nodded. Not all of them have cleared, he said. My pulse quickened. How many? He exhaled slowly. Enough to make the accounting team nervous. That was all I needed to hear. Because in the world of nonprofit finance, pledges without payments were one of the oldest tricks used to inflate perceived success. You announce large donations. You build credibility. You attract real money based on the illusion of existing support. And by the time anyone notices the gap, the damage is already done. I felt it before I saw it. That subtle shift in the room. The sense of being observed. I looked up, and there she was, Victoria, standing across the ballroom, mid-conversation, her smile still perfectly in place. But her eyes were locked on me, not casually, not curiously, intently. And then her gaze shifted slightly. To Richard. Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture did. A tightening, a calculation. She knew, or at least, she suspected. And that's when I realized something even more unsettling. This wasn't just about hiding numbers. Victoria was managing people. Managing who spoke to whom. Managing what conversations were allowed to happen. Which meant whatever she was hiding. It was bigger than I initially thought. Dinner was served shortly after. Courses arrived in perfect sequence. Wine glasses were refilled without interruption. The event moved with mechanical precision. But beneath the surface, I could feel the tension building. Then, just as the main course plates were being cleared, something unusual happened. A staff member approached each table, quietly, discreetly, placing sealed envelopes in front of selected guests. Not everyone, only certain individuals. My table was one of them. I glanced down at the envelope placed before me. It was unmarked, plain, but heavy. Across the room, I noticed similar envelopes being distributed to donors seated at other premium tables. Richard picked his up slowly. "That's new," he murmured. I turned mine over. Still nothing. No branding. I said quietly. "No explanation." Richard frowned slightly. "That's not standard." I looked up instinctively. Victoria was back on stage, watching, waiting, as if she knew exactly what was about to happen next. "Shall we?" Richard said. I hesitated for only a second before sliding my finger under the seal and opening the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. I pulled it out, and the moment my eyes scanned the contents, my breath caught, because it wasn't just a donor list. It was a detailed breakdown, transaction references, projected disbursements, internal allocation structures, information that should never have been printed and handed out publicly. And worse, some of the numbers didn't just look suspicious. They looked fabricated, completely fabricated. I glanced at Richard. His expression had changed. Gone was the calm confidence. In its place was something far more serious. "This," he said slowly, "wasn't meant to be distributed." I nodded faintly. "No, it wasn't, because this wasn't a promotional document. This was internal data. The kind of data that, if verified, could trigger a full-scale financial investigation." Across the room, murmurs were beginning to rise. Other guests had opened their envelopes, and they were seeing the same thing: confusion, concern, questions. Victoria's perfect evening was starting to fracture. I looked back down at the paper in my hand, at the names, the numbers, the inconsistencies, and then one final detail caught my eye: a column labeled, "Pending External Transfers." My stomach tightened, because next to several of the largest pledge donations were destinations, offshore accounts, untraceable entities, and suddenly, everything became clear. This wasn't just sloppy accounting. This wasn't just inflated pledges. This was something far more deliberate, far more dangerous. Victoria wasn't just hosting a charity gala. She was using it as a front. I looked up slowly. Victoria was still on stage, still smiling, still composed, as if nothing was wrong. As if she hadn't just handed a room full of powerful people the very document that could expose her. And that's when the final, chilling thought settled into place. This wasn't an accident. She meant for this to happen, but not the way it was unfolding now. Because whatever plan Victoria had set in motion, something had gone wrong. And for the first time in years, my sister was no longer in control. And as the whispers in the room grew louder, and the first guest stood up, demanding answers, I realized something else. The donor list wasn't just evidence. It was a map, and it was leading straight to the truth Victoria had spent years hiding. A truth that was about to come crashing down in front of everyone who had ever believed in her. There's a moment, just before everything collapses, when the illusion still tries to hold. That moment lived in the space between the first whisper and the first accusation. I could feel it all around me. The ballroom was still beautiful. The music still played. Waiters still moved gracefully between tables. But the energy had shifted subtly at first, then unmistakably. People were no longer admiring. They were calculating. And it all began with a single question from across the room. A man stood up from one of the premium tables near the stage, holding the same sheet I had just read. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "What exactly is this document?" he asked. The violinist faltered mid-note. The room went still. All eyes turned toward the stage, toward Victoria. She didn't hesitate. Of course she didn't. Victoria had built her entire life on moments like this. She stepped forward with the same poised smile, adjusting the microphone slightly. "That," she said smoothly, "is a preliminary internal overview for select stakeholders. A transparency initiative we're piloting this year." Her voice was calm, measured, convincing. To most people in that room, it probably sounded reasonable, but I knew better, because nothing about that document was preliminary, and nothing about it was meant for public viewing. Richard leaned closer to me, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's lying." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Across the room, more guests were studying the pages in their hands, their expressions shifting from confusion to concern. Then another voice spoke, this time sharper, more direct. If this is transparency, a woman near the front said, holding up her sheet, then why are there offshore transfer destinations listed under donor allocations? A ripple of murmurs spread instantly. That question landed hard. Victoria's smile held but just barely. Those are standard financial routing structures for international partnerships, she replied, polished, prepared, rehearsed. But this wasn't a room full of amateurs. Several of the people seated their controlled companies that moved money across borders every day. They knew what standard looked like, and this wasn't it. I watched it happen in real time. The room began to turn, not loudly, not chaotically, but deliberately. People leaned toward each other, whispering. Phones appeared under tables. Messages were being sent. Cross-checks were already happening. Victoria must have seen it too. Because for the first time that night, her gaze moved quickly across the room, not with confidence, but with calculation. She was reassessing, repositioning, trying to regain control. Her eyes landed on me, and everything changed. For a brief second, just a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. Not completely, but enough for me to see it. Recognition, not surprise, not confusion. Recognition, as if something had just confirmed a suspicion she already had. And then, something else. Anger, cold, controlled, but unmistakable. Because in that moment, Victoria realized exactly what had gone wrong. I wasn't just a guest in that room. I was a variable she hadn't accounted for. And suddenly, everything clicked into place. The invitation, the donor list, the envelopes. This wasn't a mistake. It was a setup. Victoria had planned something far more calculated than a simple charity gala. She had intended to reveal something that night, something controlled, something staged. But whatever she had intended to release was not what we were holding, which meant one thing. Someone had changed the script. Victoria. A voice called out. This one carried authority. A man stood from the table near the stage, older, composed, the kind of presence that didn't need to raise its volume to command attention. I represent one of the listed platinum sponsors, he said, and I can confirm that our pledged amount has not been dispersed. Silence. Heavy. Immediate. He lifted the paper slightly. Yet this document reflects a completed allocation. There it was. The first direct contradiction. Victoria's smile didn't disappear, but it tightened. Sir, as I mentioned, these are preliminary projections. No, he interrupted calmly. They are not. The room shifted again, more aggressively this time, because now it wasn't just suspicion. It was conflict. I hadn't planned to speak, not yet. But something about the moment, the tension, the exposure, the inevitability of what was coming pushed me forward. I stood, and just like that, the room's attention shifted again, toward me. Victoria's gaze locked onto mine instantly, sharp, warning. But I had spent too many years staying silent, too many years watching her take, manipulate, and erase. I wasn't doing that tonight. I work in nonprofit financial compliance, I said, my voice steady. And I've reviewed organizations connected to several of the names listed in this document. A few heads turned more fully now. Listening, really listening. Some of these entities, I continued, are currently under investigation. Others don't appear to exist in any verifiable registry. The murmurs grew louder, uncontrolled now. I didn't look at Victoria. Not yet. More importantly, I added, holding up the page, the allocation structures shown here are not consistent with legitimate charitable disbursement models. That landed hard. Because I hadn't accused, I had stated facts. And facts are far more dangerous. For the first time that night, Victoria addressed me directly. Adeline, she said, her tone still controlled but now carrying a sharper edge. This isn't the time or place for misunderstandings. There it was. The same strategy she had used my entire life. Minimize, redirect, discredit. I met her gaze calmly. This isn't a misunderstanding. The room went completely silent. No music, no movement. Just two sisters standing on opposite sides of a truth that could no longer be hidden. Richard stood beside me now, unplanned, unscripted, but decisive. I'd like to formally request clarification on these discrepancies, he said, addressing the room. Before any further commitments are made. That was it, the tipping point. Because once one major donor questioned legitimacy, others would follow. And they did. Voices rose from different parts of the room. Who prepared this document? Where are the actual funds? Why are these entities listed as verified sponsors? Each question struck like a hammer. And for the first time in her carefully constructed world, Victoria had no immediate answer that could silence them all. She stepped back slightly from the microphone. Just a step. But it was enough. Enough for everyone to see. The shift, the uncertainty, the loss of control. And in that moment, something extraordinary happened. The woman who had spent her entire life controlling every narrative was no longer the one directing the story. Because as powerful as that moment felt, as satisfying as it was to finally speak the truth in a room that had always ignored me, I knew something the others didn't. This wasn't the real story. Not yet. What we were seeing, the discrepancies, the suspicious donors, the fabricated allocations, that was just the surface. The real truth was buried deeper, and I had a feeling, a very strong feeling, that Victoria wasn't the only one involved. As the room continued to erupt in questions, as donors began making calls, verifying claims, demanding answers, I looked back down at the document in my hand, at one specific line I hadn't mentioned yet, one detail that didn't just suggest fraud. It pointed to something far more deliberate, a controlled transfer, scheduled, timed, and connected to a name I hadn't expected to see, a name that made everything far more personal, because it wasn't just tied to Victoria, it was tied to our family. There are moments in life when everything sharpens, the noise fades, the room blurs, and one single detail becomes impossible to ignore. For me, that moment came when I looked down at the bottom of the document again, this time not as a compliance officer, not as a cautious observer, but as someone who had finally stopped giving her sister the benefit of the doubt. Because buried beneath the donor allocations, beneath the offshore routing structures, beneath the inflated pledges, was a name I recognized instantly, not from work, not from an investigation, but from my own life. I didn't react immediately. Years of professional discipline kept my face neutral, my posture steady, but inside, something shifted, slow, cold, certain, because that trust account should not exist. Our father had created a family trust years before he passed. It was never large enough to attract public attention, but it was meaningful, carefully structured, conservative, designed to support both of us equally over time. I remember sitting in his study the day he explained it. Adeline, he had said gently, this isn't about wealth, it's about stability, protection, balance. Victoria had been there too, listening, smiling, agreeing, at least on the surface. After he died, the trust was supposed to remain untouched except under clearly defined conditions. Neither of us had unilateral control. Every disbursement required dual authorization. That was the entire point, which meant one thing. If funds from that trust were now appearing in a document tied to offshore transfers, then someone had broken the structure, deliberately, this time more carefully. The line item was small compared to the others, almost invisible if you weren't paying attention, but it was there. The amount wasn't the largest on the page, but it didn't need to be, because it wasn't about the size, it was about the access, and the implication. Someone had not only accessed the trust, they had scheduled a transfer, without my authorization. Victoria hadn't just built her empire on borrowed ideas and manipulated narratives. She had gone further. She had found a way to use what wasn't hers, to move money that required both of us, which meant one of two things. Either she had forged my authorization, or she had found a way to bypass it entirely. Both possibilities led to the same conclusion. This wasn't just unethical. This was criminal. Around me, the tension had escalated. Phones were no longer hidden. Voices were no longer hushed. Donors were standing now, some angry, some confused, some already calculating their exit strategies. The illusion of elegance had shattered. What remained was exposure, raw and immediate. And yet, in the center of it all, Victoria was still trying to hold the line. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, stepping forward again, her voice firm, measured, commanding. I understand your concerns, but I assure you, every financial structure represented here has been reviewed by our internal team, not external auditors, not independent verification, internal. That choice of words mattered, because it revealed something critical. She didn't expect scrutiny from outside. She expected control from within. This time, I didn't wait. This line item, I said, my voice cutting through the noise. I held up the document. Who authorized the Hartwell Legacy Trust transfer? The effect was immediate, not just on the room, on her. For the first time that night, Victoria froze, not visibly enough for most people to notice. But I saw it, because I knew her. The microsecond pause, the slight tightening of her jaw, the calculation. She hadn't expected that question. Not tonight. This time, I didn't wait. This line item, I said, my voice cutting through the noise. I held up the document. Who authorized the Hartwell Legacy Trust transfer? The effect was immediate, not just on the room, on her. For the first time that night, Victoria froze, not visibly enough for most people to notice. But I saw it, because I knew her. The microsecond pause, the slight tightening of her jaw, the calculation. She hadn't expected that question. Not tonight. What is she referring to? Someone asked. Another voice followed quickly. A family trust? Is that part of the foundation's funding? The questions came faster now, closer, sharper, because this wasn't just about corporate donors anymore. This was personal, and personal scandals spread faster than financial ones. Carefully, too carefully. That is a legacy allocation connected to long-term philanthropic planning, she said smoothly. It was a good answer, technically vague, strategically neutral, but it wasn't the truth. And for the first time, I didn't let it pass. The words came out calm, clear, undeniable. That trust requires dual authorization, I continued. Any transfer without both signatures is invalid. Silence. Absolute. Because now the room understood. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a contradiction. And contradictions demand resolution. I could feel it. The subtle but undeniable shift. Minutes ago, Victoria had been the center of admiration. Now she was the center of scrutiny. And I, the sister she had just publicly dismissed as an embarrassment, was the one holding the room's attention. Are you saying, Richard asked slowly, stepping forward again, that funds may have been allocated without proper authorization? He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to, because the implication was already there. Heavy, dangerous, irreversible. Victoria looked at him, then at me, and for the first time since the night began, she didn't answer immediately. She knew the line had been crossed, not just in private, but in public, in a room full of people who had the power to investigate, expose, and dismantle everything she had built. And worse, she knew I wasn't finished, because what I hadn't told them, what I hadn't revealed yet, was that I had seen something else, something even more damning than the unauthorized trust transfer, a timestamp, a scheduled movement of funds, set to execute, within hours. This was timing, precise, intentional, calculated. Victoria hadn't just been manipulating numbers. She had been preparing something, a final move, one that required the Gala, the donors, the illusion of legitimacy. And once it was complete, the money would be gone, untraceable, irrecoverable. I could have said it right then, exposed everything in one moment, ended it immediately. But I didn't, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to Victoria. I was thinking ahead of her, and I realized something important. If I revealed everything too soon, she would still find a way to escape. Victoria had always been good at that, redirecting, deflecting, surviving. No, if this was going to end, it had to end completely, just slightly, enough to let the tension build, enough to let the room continue asking questions, enough to let Victoria try and fail to regain control, because the more she spoke, the more she revealed, and the closer she moved to making a mistake she couldn't recover from. A voice came from the back of the room, calm, unfamiliar, and far more dangerous than the others. I think, the man said slowly, we're asking the wrong question. The room turned. He stepped forward into the light. I didn't recognize him, but Victoria did, and the moment she saw him, everything changed. Not a flicker, not a pause, a full, visible reaction. Shock, real, uncontrolled, the kind she couldn't hide. This wasn't just about financial misconduct. This wasn't just about inflated donations or unauthorized transfers. This was bigger, far bigger, because whoever that man was, he wasn't part of the plan, and whatever he was about to say was something Victoria had never intended anyone in that room to hear. As the entire ballroom fell silent once again, as every eye fixed on the stranger now walking toward the stage. I felt something I hadn't felt all night. Not anger, not satisfaction, but anticipation. Because for the first time, I wasn't the only one who knew the truth, and whatever came next was going to change everything. There are revelations that shake a room, and then there are revelations that silence it. The man walking toward the stage carried the second kind. Measured steps, calm expression, no urgency, no hesitation, just quiet certainty. He didn't look like someone trying to interrupt an event. He looked like someone who had been waiting for the exact right moment to speak. And judging by the way Victoria's composure fractured the instant she saw him, he had found it. That was the first thing I understood, not from anything he said, from her. Victoria Hartwell, the woman who had controlled every room she had ever entered, had just taken a full step back. Not strategically, not gracefully, instinctively. Her hand tightened slightly around the microphone. Her shoulders stiffened, and for the first time that night, she looked cornered. He repeated it as he approached the stage, his voice calm but firm enough to carry across the entire ballroom. Security hesitated. You could see it. They weren't sure whether to stop him or let him through, because he didn't look like a threat. He looked like he belonged, and that was far more dangerous. Sir, one of the event coordinators began. It's fine, he said, not even looking at them. Then his eyes lifted, straight to Victoria. I believe Miss Hartwell would prefer I speak. A pause. A long one. And then Victoria nodded. Barely, but enough. Let him through. The atmosphere shifted instantly. This was no longer a charity gala. This was an unfolding exposure, the kind that people would talk about for years. Phones were no longer hidden now. Several guests were openly recording. Others were dialing advisors, lawyers, assistants, because everyone in that room understood something critical. Whatever was about to be revealed, it had financial consequences. The man stepped beside Victoria, but not too close. Carefully positioned, deliberate, as if even proximity to her mattered. He didn't introduce himself immediately. Instead, he turned slowly, scanning the room, assessing, measuring. Then he spoke. My name is Elliot Crane. A few people reacted, subtly. Recognition. That name meant something. I felt it immediately, because I had heard it before. Not recently, but years ago, in a report, in an internal briefing tied to, and then it hit me. Elliot Crane. He had been the lead forensic analyst on a multi-state financial investigation involving shell corporations and misappropriated nonprofit funds. The case had gone quiet, abruptly, no resolution, no public closure, just gone. At the time, it didn't make sense. Now it did. I was hired, he said calmly, to audit several organizations listed in tonight's donor registry. The room leaned in, not physically, but collectively. You could feel it. The initial scope of my work was limited, he continued. Standard due diligence, verification of donor legitimacy, transaction pathways, compliance structures. He paused, just long enough. However, what I discovered went far beyond routine irregularities. Elliot, she said sharply, stepping slightly forward. This is neither the time nor the setting, it's exactly the setting, he replied, not raising his voice, but cutting cleanly through hers. And that was the moment she lost it. Not visibly, not to most people, but to me. I saw it, because for the first time, someone wasn't playing by her rules. Several of the organizations listed as major donors tonight, Elliot continued, are not independent entities. Murmurs spread instantly. They are financially linked through layered ownership structures, he said. Shell corporations designed to obscure origin and control. That landed hard. Because now this wasn't just about questionable donors. This was about fabricated legitimacy. Additionally, he went on, a significant portion of the pledged funds do not exist as liquid assets. A sharper reaction this time. Voices, confusion, anger. Instead, he said, they are projected figures used to create the appearance of high-value backing. I didn't need to look at Victoria. I could feel the impact of each word hitting her. The purpose of this structure, Elliot said, is to attract real capital under the assumption of existing support. The room erupted, not loudly, but intensely, because now the picture was clear. This wasn't mismanagement. This was strategy, deliberate. A sharper reaction this time. Voices, confusion, anger. Instead, he said, they are projected figures used to create the appearance of high-value backing. I didn't need to look at Victoria. I could feel the impact of each word hitting her. The purpose of this structure, Elliot said, is to attract real capital under the assumption of existing support. The room erupted, not loudly, but intensely, because now the picture was clear. This wasn't mismanagement. This was strategy, deliberate. A sharper reaction this time. Voices, confusion, anger. Instead, he said, they are projected figures used to create the appearance of high-value backing. I didn't need to look at Victoria. I could feel the impact of each word hitting her. The purpose of this structure, Elliot said, is to attract real capital under the assumption of existing support. The room erupted, not loudly, but intensely, because now the picture was clear. This wasn't mismanagement. This was strategy, deliberate. A sharper reaction this time. Voices, confusion, anger. Instead, he said, they are projected figures used to create the appearance of high-value backing. I didn't need to look at Victoria. I could feel the impact of each word hitting her. The purpose of this structure, Elliot said, is to attract real capital under the assumption of existing support. The room erupted, not loudly, but intensely, because now the picture was clear. This wasn't mismanagement. This was strategy, deliberate, controlled, but final. The room froze again. She stepped forward, no longer pretending, no longer softening her tone. You've said more than enough, she continued. This is an internal matter, and it will be handled internally, Elliot repeated. And this time, there was something different in his voice. Not calm, not neutral, but deliberate, targeted. Is that how you handled the last one? Victoria's face lost color. Not completely, but enough for everyone to notice. And suddenly, I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't the first time. What does he mean? Someone asked. Last what? Are there other incidents? The questions came faster now, sharper, relentless, because once people sense a pattern, they don't stop digging. Elliot turned fully toward the audience. 3 years ago, he said, a similar structure was used in a smaller scale event tied to a regional arts foundation. I felt my pulse quicken, because I remembered that case. Vaguely, funds had disappeared, quietly, no charges, no public fallout. It had just vanished. Elliot's voice was steady, measured, but every word carried weight, because the primary evidence was withdrawn. Silence, deep, unsettling. And then he looked at Victoria again, directly, withdrawn by the same individual who organized this event. Not all of it, not yet, but enough to shift everything, enough to destroy the illusion, enough to make it clear that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake. This was a pattern, and Victoria Hartwell was at the center of it, because as powerful as Elliot's revelations were, there was still one piece missing, one final detail that would connect everything: the shell companies, the fabricated pledges, the trust account, the timing, and most importantly, the exit. Because this wasn't just about creating an illusion, it was about taking something and disappearing before anyone realized it. This time, I didn't hesitate, because I knew exactly what needed to be said. Check the timestamps, I said clearly. The room turned to me again. Elliot didn't speak. He just watched. Those transfers aren't theoretical, I continued. They're scheduled. A ripple of realization moved through the crowd. Tonight, I added quietly. They're scheduled for tonight. That was the moment everything changed. Not gradually, not subtly, completely, and disappearing before anyone realized it. This time, I didn't hesitate, because I knew exactly what needed to be said. Check the timestamps, I said clearly. The room turned to me again. Elliot didn't speak. He just watched. Those transfers aren't theoretical, I continued. They're scheduled. A ripple of realization moved through the crowd. Tonight, I added quietly. They're scheduled for tonight. That was the moment everything changed. Not gradually, not subtly, completely. And as the room erupted into action calls being made, advisors being summoned, legal teams already mobilizing, I realized something with absolute clarity. This wasn't just the night my sister's reputation collapsed. This was the night everything she had built began to fall apart in real time. But even then, even as the truth surfaced, even as the plan unraveled, there was one final question left unanswered, one final move she hadn't made yet. And knowing Victoria the way I did, I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. There's a particular kind of silence that comes just before panic. It isn't loud. It isn't chaotic. It's sharp, focused, Electric. That was the silence that filled the ballroom after I said the words. They're scheduled for tonight. Everything changed in that instant. Phones came out fully now, not discreetly. Voices overlapped. Call legal. Freeze the accounts. Verify the transfers now. Some guests were already standing, stepping away from their tables, forming tight clusters with advisors and assistants. This was no longer about reputation. This was about money in motion, and everyone in that room understood the same thing at the same time. If those transfers went through, it wouldn't just be difficult to recover the funds, it would be almost impossible. Which accounts? Elliot asked, turning to me immediately. Direct, efficient, no wasted motion. I flipped the document open again, my fingers steady despite the rising tension. Look at the bottom allocation column, I said. The ones marked pending external transfers. Cross-reference the routing codes. He stepped beside me, scanning quickly. His expression changed, subtly, but enough. These aren't standard clearing timelines, he said under his breath. No, I replied. They're staggered releases. He nodded once. That was all the confirmation he needed. Then he turned sharply toward the room. We need immediate contact with financial institutions tied to these routing paths, he said, voice now carrying authority that cut through the chaos. Every minute matters. That was what unsettled me. More than the accusations, more than the exposure. Victoria was still standing there, calm, too calm. Her hands rested lightly at her sides, her breathing steady, her posture composed. The room was unraveling around her, and yet, she wasn't reacting the way someone losing everything should. She wasn't panicking. She was thinking. Victoria never built plans with a single point of failure. Never. Everything she did had layers, fallbacks, redundancies, which meant if we had discovered the scheduled transfers, then what we were seeing might not be the real exit. My voice cut through just enough to get his attention. He turned. What if these aren't the primary transfers? I said quietly. His eyes narrowed. Explain. I pointed to the document. These are too visible, too structured, too easy to trace once flagged. He followed my reasoning instantly. You're saying this is a decoy. I'm saying, I corrected. This is what she expected us to find. Not concern, not confusion, recognition. Because now the situation had escalated beyond financial irregularity. This was strategy, and Victoria Hartwell was very good at strategy. Elliot turned back toward the room, his tone sharper now. Do not focus solely on the listed transfers, he called out. If this structure is compromised, there is likely a secondary pathway in motion that landed hard, because now the urgency doubled to possibilities, to threats, and no clear visibility on the second. Victoria hadn't spoken, not once, since I revealed the timing, but now, she smiled, just slightly, so subtle most people would have missed it, but I didn't, because I knew that smile. I had seen it before, years ago, when she forged my scholarship withdrawal, when she presented my proposal as her own, when she took what wasn't hers and convinced the world it had always belonged to her. That smile meant one thing. She still believed she could win. I forced myself to think, not emotionally, not reactively, but the way I always had with structure. What was missing? What hadn't been accounted for? We had. Shell donors fabricated pledge scheduled transfers, a compromised trust, but something still didn't align. The scale was too large, the exposure too risky. Victoria would never execute a plan this visible without a guaranteed exit. So where was it? Not on the document, not in the room, but in my memory. A detail I had overlooked earlier. Something Richard had said. The scale of funding has grown significantly this year, not gradually, not over time, suddenly, which meant the infrastructure for this plan hadn't been built over years. It had been accelerated, recently. I said it out loud without realizing. Elliot turned immediately. What? The third-party coordinator managing donor intake, I said. That's where the real movement is happening. His eyes sharpened. Because that's where the funds are aggregated before allocation. Exactly. And if that system is external, then it's outside immediate oversight, I finished. That was the gap, the blind spot. Victoria hadn't just manipulated donors. She had inserted an external mechanism, a controlled funnel, one that allowed funds to move before they were ever formally recorded within the foundation's internal system, which meant by the time anyone audited the foundation itself, the money would already be gone. Who's handling the coordination? He demanded. I didn't need to check. I saw the name earlier. It's a firm flagged in prior investigations. Name, I told him. His jaw tightened slightly. I know them. Of course he did. Calls were being made. Instructions were being issued. But I could see it in Elliot's face. We weren't ahead. We were catching up. And in financial systems like this, catching up is often too late. Are you finished? The room quieted. Not completely, but enough. She stepped forward again, reclaiming the space not with authority this time, but with something more dangerous. Acceptance. You've all made quite the scene, she said calmly. No denial, no defense, just observation. That's fine, she continued. You should ask questions. You should investigate. You should verify everything. Her eyes moved across the room, then landed on me, direct, unblinking. But you're still thinking too small. A chill ran through me, because I knew what that meant. The words landed softly, but they hit harder than anything she had said all evening. A ripple of confusion spread through the room. What does that mean? Someone asked. Victoria didn't answer them. She kept looking at me. This was just the visible layer, she said quietly. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't the operation. This was the distraction, the noise, the spectacle, something big enough to draw attention, to occupy scrutiny, to keep everyone focused on the wrong thing, while something else, something far more critical happened somewhere else entirely. Not uncertain, not reactive, certain. Where is it? I asked. Her smile widened slightly. There it was again, that same smile, the one that always came just before she revealed how far ahead she really was. You'll figure it out, she replied softly. A pause. Then, just like you always do, that was the moment I stopped seeing her as my sister. Not emotionally, but strategically, because this wasn't personal to her. Not anymore. This was execution. And she was already moving toward the next phase. Somewhere outside that ballroom something was happening. A transfer, a transaction, a movement of assets we hadn't identified yet. And whatever it was the real objective. Adeline, he said quietly, if you're right, I am. He nodded once. Then we're already behind. She wasn't watching the room anymore. She wasn't watching Elliot. She was watching me, waiting, almost, expectant. As if this had always been part of it. As if she had always known I would be the one to follow the trail far enough. And that was the most unsettling realization of all. Because it meant one thing. I hadn't just walked into her plan. I had been part of it. From the very beginning. And now, whether I wanted to or not, I was going to have to finish it. There's a difference between being invited into a plan and being designed into it. I understood that difference the moment Victoria said, "You'll figure it out." She hadn't just anticipated me noticing the discrepancies. She had counted on it, which meant everything that had happened so far, the donor list, the envelopes, the exposure, was only part of the architecture, the visible part, the part meant to hold attention, while the real movement happened elsewhere. I stopped looking at the room. Noise faded again. Voices, calls, movement, all of it became background, because I realized something critical. If Victoria had built this with me in mind, then the answer wasn't in the data alone. It was in the patterns she knew I would follow. Victoria didn't build messy systems. She built layered ones, elegant, controlled, each layer designed to misdirect until the final move was complete. So if this gala was the distraction, and the scheduled transfers were the decoy, then the real operation had to meet three conditions. It had to move quickly, it had to complete quickly, it had to appear legitimate long enough to avoid immediate interruption, which meant it wouldn't be hidden in chaos. It would be hidden in routine. And then I saw it, not in the document, not in the room, but in the event structure itself. The gala wasn't just a fundraising event. It was a commitment event. Pledges, authorizations, digital confirmations, live processing. I turned sharply to Elliot. The payment confirmations, I said. His eyes locked onto mine. What about them? They're being processed in real time. A beat. Then where? He asked. The control room of every major event like this had one. A temporary operations hub, secure terminals, financial coordination, live transaction tracking, and most importantly, access. Immediate access to donor authorizations. Where is it? Elliot asked again. I didn't answer, because I already knew. I had seen it earlier. When I arrived, a restricted corridor behind the ballroom, staff only, security controlled. At the time, it meant nothing. Now it meant everything. We moved fast. No announcement, no hesitation. Elliot followed without question. Behind us, the room continued unraveling, but that no longer mattered, because whatever Victoria had set in motion was happening right now. The noise dropped the moment we stepped out of the ballroom. Muted, distant, the hallway was dimly lit, quiet, controlled. Too controlled. Two security personnel stood near the restricted door. They straightened as we approached. Authorized personnel only, one of them said. Elliot didn't slow. Step aside. They didn't. Not immediately. And that hesitation told me everything. They weren't just guarding a room. They were guarding a process. Now, Elliot's voice changed. Not louder, but absolute. The kind of tone that doesn't invite resistance. And this time, they moved. The room was smaller than I expected, but dense. Screens, terminals, 3 staff members seated, focused, moving quickly between systems. At the center, a lead operator, headset on, eyes fixed on a primary display. We didn't need introductions. I walked straight to the main screen, and there it wasn't a list of donors, not allocations. A live transaction interface, multiple confirmations, green indicators, completed authorizations, and one section still active, highlighted, processing. The real transfer, it wasn't labeled under the foundation. It wasn't labeled under any of the donor entities. It was routed through the third-party coordinator, just like I suspected. But the destination, that was the final layer. A consolidation account, temporary, clean, structured to receive multiple inputs before dispersal. A live transaction interface, multiple confirmations, green indicators, completed authorizations, and one section still active, highlighted, processing. The real transfer, it wasn't labeled under the foundation. It wasn't labeled under any of the donor entities. It was routed through the third-party coordinator, just like I suspected. But the destination, that was the final layer. A consolidation account, temporary, clean, structured to receive multiple inputs before dispersal. And once dispersed, untraceable. Stop it, Elliot said immediately. The operator froze. I can't, he stammered. It's already in sequence. How much? Elliot demanded. The man hesitated, then answered. Everything. Everything, not just the questionable funds, not just the fabricated pledges. Everything that had been legitimately committed that night. Every real donor, every verified transfer, all being funneled into a single structure. Victoria's real planet wasn't just fraud. It was convergence. Use fake credibility to attract real money. Aggregate it quickly. Move it before anyone could react. And let the visible scandal consume attention while the real transaction completed quietly. How long? I asked. The operator checked the screen. 3 minutes. That was all that stood between exposure and completion. Elliot moved to the terminal. Override access, he said. It requires executive authorization. The operator replied. Of course it did. Victoria's final safeguard. And then I understood my role completely, not partially, not theoretically, completely. Victoria hadn't just expected me to find this. She had needed me too. Because there was only one other person tied to this system with executive authority. Me, through the trust, through the shared financial structures, through the legacy access I had never used. Step aside. My voice came out calm, steady, certain. The operator hesitated, then moved. The terminology interface, authorization prompt, dual layer verification. I entered my credentials. The system paused, processing. Then access granted. Elliot looked at me. Can you stop it? I didn't answer immediately, because I could. But stopping it wasn't enough. Not if Victoria had built another layer. Not if this was only part of the exit. Think one step ahead always. That was how she operated. So that was how I needed to respond. I didn't stop the transfer, redirected it. Elliot saw it. His eyes widened slightly. You're rerouting? Yes. Where? I didn't look at him. To a controlled holding account. Traceable, fully, and recoverable. Every cent. The system updated. Processing shifted. Routing changed. The destination account replaced. The countdown continued. But now the endpoint was different. 1 minute room was silent except for the soft hum of the system. No one spoke. No one moved. 30 seconds. He could feel it. The weight of it. Years of quiet manipulation. Years of watching. Years of restraint. All converging into this one moment. Completeth screen changed. Green across all lines. Processing finished. It was over. The money hadn't disappeared. It hadn't scattered. It hadn't vanished into offshore networks. It was contained. Visible. Recoverable. Elliot exhaled slowly. That's it, he said. Yes, I replied. It's done. Behind us a slow clap. We turned. Victoria stood in the doorway. She didn't look angry. That was the unsettling part. She didn't look defeated either. She looked impressed. I was right about you. Her voice was soft, almost reflective. You always were the one who understood systems. I held her gaze. You built this. Yes. No denial. No hesitation. Just truth. Why? The question came from Elliot, but I already knew the answer. Victoria smiled faintly. Because perception is power, she said. And for years, I built perception. She glanced at me. You built structure. She stepped further into the room. No one questions success when it looks this convincing, she continued. Not donors, not regulators, not even family. A pause. Then until you. I stepped forward. This ends now, I said. She nodded slightly. Yes, she replied. It does. She didn't run, didn't argue, didn't resist. Because for the first time, there was nowhere left to go. The investigation moved quickly, faster than anything I had ever seen. Because this time, everything was visible, documented, traceable. The shell structures, the fabricated donors, the prior incident Elliot referenced. All of it surfaced, all of it connected. Victoria Hartwell's Embarrass collapse overnight. It unraveled, piece by piece, publicly, irreversibly. And me, for the first time in my life, I wasn't standing in her shadow. I wasn't correcting her work quietly. I wasn't watching from the sidelines. I had stepped into the center of the system, and I had held it together, while she tried to tear it apart. The last time I saw her, it wasn't dramatic. No final confrontation, no shouting, just a moment, brief, quiet. As she was being led away, she looked at me once, and smiled, not arrogantly, not mockingly, but knowingly. You finally stopped me. Her words, soft, almost proud. I didn't smile back because this was never about stopping her. Not really. It was about ending it completely. And as I stood there watching everything she had built dissolve into truth, I realized something I hadn't understood before. This wasn't just her story, and it wasn't just mine. It was the story of what happens when control goes unchecked for too long, and what it takes to finally break it.